Our program today is part of a series of interviews we've got at TCC, where we're interviewing some of the longer term members who it's possible to think of as our elders, people who have been in the service, in the congregation, not so much by their age, but by their length of time within the service, within the congregation. And our interviewee today is Shirley Ranz, who has been in the congregation, as she said in the promotion for this event, since almost day one. And we're going to explore that a bit with Shirley in a minute. But let me just say a few things about Shirley based on her own self-introduction for the promotion for this interview. Now, Shirley's been active in the congregation in many ways. She's a former vice president, a former board member, and she's now the co-chair of the Shabbat Committee. Here I'm going to quote from what she wrote in her promotional piece. I grew up in a home steeped in secular Yiddish culture and Socialist Zionism, leading her into Humanistic Judaism as a natural next step from that. So, Shirley, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
You look ready. Now, before we start, I'd just like to draw attention to the photograph that you contributed for the promotional part, for the promotional notice for this service. It's a beautiful photo. Can you just tell us where that was taken?
It was actually about half a block away from the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where for the last few years I've been a docent, and was right before the pandemic also training to be part of their heritage testimonies. I can explain that later, but that's where it was. So it's a meaningful location for me.
It's very nice to know that, Shirley. We're definitely going to come back to that. You're volunteering with the Museum for Jewish Heritage, but I'd like to go back much earlier in your life, and or actually I'd like to go back to much earlier in the life of the congregation, and to follow up on this idea that you've been with the community almost since day one. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Think back on the early days of TCC. You have a longer memory, I think, than most of us of that time. And what can you share with us about that time?
Well, prior to the formation of this congregation, I was a member of the society. There was no New York City chapter. One time, Henry, my husband, and I attended a meeting at some Long Island chapter, a small group of very elderly people. So there was no one there our age. Then I got a call one day from Myrna Barron, who said that she's looking to start up a New York City chapter. And I was very overjoyed because I just did not feel at that point in my life that I had a home for me to be Jewish in a way that was comfortable for me. So I went to the following meeting. Apparently there was one meeting before that where Myrna and Billy Pivnik, who is Sharon Wine's niece, and another woman who came from the Detroit congregation, got together and said, let's start a chapter. They called all the at-large members like myself in the New York City area. And then we went to the second meeting, and there were enough people who wanted to really form this congregation. We met in each other's homes for the first few years. Myrna, this was her brainchild, and she devoted so much of her time and energy. Fortunately, she had a background in public relations, and her then husband, Ken, had an advertising agency, and I'm sure that was very helpful in getting the word out.
Well, you also could remember back on the days of Sherwin Wine from back then too. Are there any memories you have of him you'd like to share?
Well, besides having read his articles in the journal, and I think I read his book as well, just meeting him in person, he was such a charming person, and he had the ability. He was a great speaker in that he could simplify things to, complex thoughts he could make very simple. And so I'm sure he could reach everybody.
Yeah. Well, I know there are others in the congregation who remember him, and we could probably go on at greater length at another time. But let's get back to your own life, Shirley. You probably can't remember back to day one of your own life, or even day two, but you did share in the promotional piece that you grew up with secular Zionism and Yiddish culture. So I wonder if you can just share with us a little bit about the impact of those things on your life, and a little bit about your parents. They must have been committed to those things too.
Well, my parents were Polish Jews, Holocaust survivors, and they were a couple in Poland before the war began. My father recruited my mother into the Socialist Zionist movement, and they were even on a kibbutz in Poland. So they sent me, when I was a kid here, to a summer camp in the Catskills, to one of those social Zionist camps. And they also sent me to the Workman's Circle School during the year, where I learned Yiddish and Jewish history and Hebrew. And to my regret, I really wasn't that interested in Yiddish, even though I heard it being spoken at home. I just sensed that the future language of the Jewish people was going to be Hebrew. And so I put my energy into learning Hebrew.
But you have some regret for not having spent more time with Yiddish.
Right. I would like to be more fluent in it than I am. I have a fairly good understanding of, conversational Yiddish. I can get by, and I speak to my father in Yiddish when I need to. But it would be nice to know it better, even though I don't think it's practical. And that's why I've never devoted any more time to learning it.
Yeah. How did you like our songs today? We had some Yiddish songs.
Yeah, I love it. I love
it.
Thank you, Rebecca, for choosing those songs. I wonder if it was because of me.
Absolutely.
But, I introduced those songs. I really enjoy using older melodies because it unites us with the rest of the Jewish world.
That's a nice thought. We're going to come back to music in a minute, because I know it's an important part of your life. But I'd like to move on to another topic from your background. Both of us, I think, are very fond of the lecture format. We're unusual in that. Most people who I know don't really care that much for lectures, and there's a lot of doubt in the field of pedagogy about how useful they are for teaching. But you and I do like them. And sometimes we'll both be at a lecture together at the Center for Jewish History. So I have a deep sense that education and learning have always been important to you, whether in formal schooling or outside of formal schooling. So can you just share with us a bit about things you studied over the course of your life that you've enjoyed, and maybe some things that you're studying now?
Well, my academic career was a bachelor's degree in French, a master's in linguistics, and then for practical reasons, I didn't continue in the humanities, and I needed to earn a living. So I switched to the sciences, which I had always enjoyed, and studied pharmacy and became a pharmacist. And then now in my life, I was able to retire at a fairly young age. And since I did retire, I've been auditing courses at Brooklyn College for many years in Jewish studies, American history, European history, and now I'm going back to an old love, linguistics. And I taught at Brooklyn College. There's an institute for seniors for continuous, it's called Brooklyn Lifelong Learning. And I taught French there. And I also taught a course, Yiddish authors in America in translation.
Well, you also taught us at Hanukkah a little bit about the Maccabees, as I remember. So that's yet another interest for you, I think.
Right. I was fascinated. I attended a week-long seminar upstate at Skidmore College one year. They used to have a summer program in Judaic studies, and that whole week was devoted to the era of the Maccabees, and it was fascinating.
Yeah. They can fall through the cracks if it's not Hanukkah. So thanks for that, Shirley. Let's move on. You mentioned that you studied to be a pharmacist and were a pharmacist. I always notice when I look at surveys of the most trusted occupations that pharmacists are often number one on the list. So I wonder if you could share some thoughts on why that might be, and to just give us a sense of what a typical day in your life as a pharmacist was like.
I really have no idea why people trust pharmacists more than other professions. So I can't help you with that.
All right.
I mostly worked in hospitals because I found it to be more interesting, more rewarding, less of the business aspect of the profession. I would, a typical day, I would be making chemotherapy infusions or infusions for people who couldn't eat. So they would have, their food would be going through one of their major veins in their neck. I dispensed narcotics to methadone patients. And sometimes I made unique formulations in capsules or lotions, the way the old time pharmacists used to do. So, and then I would review all the medications to look for drug interactions and to make sure that the hospital doctors got the right dose for the right patient and so on.
I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about how you approach religious music, which often has the word God in it, and your experiences singing in a choir. What's meant most to you about doing that?
Well, what's meant most to me about singing in a choir is the ability to create something beautiful without having a fantastic voice. And I love harmony. And so singing in 4-part harmony, and each of us, each voice contributing to making something unique and beautiful, it's been very exciting. And I once read an article that explained that people who sing in a choir, when after they actually, their heartbeats synchronize and their hearts are beating together. It's just, you have to experience it to know what it is. It's a wonderful feeling. And as far as religious music, thanks to Sherwin Wine, I find a way out of that dilemma. I just simply, I have to sing the lyrics, but I ignore their meaning and try to think of other things, because sometimes I do find it disturbing that I'm saying these things that I have not only don't believe in, but I'm opposed to.
Right. Well, in terms of the harmonies, I shared with the group that you tried to teach us the song Dona Nobis Pacem from the Catholic Mass. And I just shared that it was a sign of your ecumenical approach to music, that you could bring that to us. And certainly the sense of harmony in that is very lovely when you get the 3 parts going. But we moved on after that, Shirley, and here just to pick up with you again on your social activism. And I was just telling the group a little bit about your activism with NOW, the National Organization for Women, and your advocacy for women in the sex business to round up the pimps who promote that and arrest them so that women are not subject to that exploitation. But I wanted just to ask if there were other causes that NOW pursues that you'd like to share with the group.
Well, I think many of you may have heard me speak about domestic workers and how exploited they are. They're not paid for all the hours that they work.
Yes.
And they're just, even the union is not on their side. And that's very disturbing to me, because when I was a pharmacist, I was active in the union and I promoted the union. And generally unions are a good thing, but in this particular case, 1199, which is the hospital workers union, is just caving into the threats on the part of the home care industry that if they had to pay these women for the hours they work, they would go bankrupt. And of course, that's just nonsense. Or even if it's partially true, that would just mean that the state would have to come forth with more funds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's that. I'm pretty proud of the fact that my chapter, the Brooklyn Queens chapter, of which I was president for 13 years, was very instrumental in getting a law passed that outlawed female genital mutilation, which was actually happening in Brooklyn in hospitals, no less. So
yeah. No, that's been a major issue. Well, beyond the social activism, the topic that I just brought up before you came back was the different places that you've lived in the world and your travels. And I was sharing a little bit about your time on the kibbutz in Israel. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that time of your life? What kind of kibbutz it was, and maybe what a day in the life of the kibbutz was like for you?
It was a very different life than anything I had experienced before, even though I was very prepared for the ideology. It was a kibbutz, a fairly well-established kibbutz in the Negev desert. By the way, I don't like desert terrain. I'm a lake and mountains person. It was hard work. I had to wake up at 3 a.m, go out in the fields, my first job was to pick gladioli, which was rather backbreaking work. And eventually I got an indoor job, indoor meaning in the barn with the cows. And I was milking cows for several months and cleaning the tanks. And it was good work. I did admire very much the way of life on the kibbutz, the fact that everyone shared, everyone had equal income. They had a lot of free time because the communal setting of not having to cook your own meals, not having to do your own laundry, all that gave people more leisure time. And so that was nice.
Well, the other place that you've lived is France. So can you tell us a little bit about why you were there?
Well, as I mentioned, I had a bachelor's degree in French and I wanted to go live in France for a while. So I enrolled in a master's program with CUNY for studying abroad. They sent me to a city called Nancy in the northeast. And it was a lovely city. And I really wasn't serious about getting the degree because I knew I wasn't going to go on for a PhD. So I dropped out and got a job teaching in a local junior high school where the teacher had become sick and they needed a substitute. I didn't enjoy the teaching, but I really enjoyed living there for a year.
And could you have a conversation in French today if you wanted?
Oh, yeah. I haven't, had an opportunity to speak it for many years, but I whenever I watch a French movie, I can pretty much understand what they're saying. And I've had lots of guests from France visit.
Okay, Shirley. Well, we're coming to the end of the interview. I have just a couple more questions to ask. What has to do with your jewelry making? So this is something that you've been doing for a while. Some members of the congregation own some of your pieces. Maybe you're wearing a piece now. Is that so?
Yeah. Can you see it?
Can we?
Let's see. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, I can see very nicely. I hope most people can in speaker view. It's a lovely piece. What is that made of?
It's freshwater pearls. The green stone is called amazonite, and then the pink is the Swarovski crystals, and the little silver beads in between.
And how did you get into jewelry making?
On one of my trips to Europe, in Eastern Europe, I remember every day, it was a riverboat cruise, and every day we'd get off the boat and go into town and go into the marketplace and all those outdoor booths with a lot of them were handmade jewelry. And I just thought I could do this too. It didn't seem too complicated. So when I came home, a friend of mine who taught me the basics, and then I taught myself and took courses, and I never thought I was creative before that. I knew I liked doing crafts, but when I got into making jewelry, I was able to express my creativity in terms of color and texture, and it's kind of meditative in the making.
And where do you get your supplies?
Mostly online, and I used to go to there used to be a district in Manhattan near Macy's, which had lots of jewelry supply stores, but that pretty much, even before the pandemic, when the economy was not doing well, a lot of those stores closed. So there are bead shows twice a year in New York but I've stopped buying materials because I have so much. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that bit as well. The last question has to do with the volunteering you mentioned way up at the front of the interview at the Museum for Jewish Heritage, where you've been a docent for about 2 years. And I think many of us who know you know that remembering the Holocaust is very important for you. Can you talk a little bit about your docent work there and the significance of remembering the Holocaust for you?
Well, my father created an organization in the late 70s called the Generation After for survivors, children of survivors, and anyone who wanted to join. And it was very politically oriented. He wasn't interested in bemoaning the Holocaust or even relating his own personal suffering. He wanted people to learn the political lessons of the Holocaust. And that went on for about 25 years until he could no longer handle it. And so I felt a great need to contribute to Holocaust education. And thankfully, the museum fulfilled that need for me. They trained me to give the tours, and it's mostly for school children, most of whom are not Jewish. And thankfully, New York State has a requirement that Holocaust be taught. I just saw on the news the other day, Delaware just joined now. They also have a requirement. So I hope it makes a difference that I can tell these children where racial hatred and ethnic hatred can lead.
There's also a program there called Heritage Testimonies. Can you say a little bit about what that is?
So that's for the fact that most Holocaust survivors are now deceased, and there are very few left who are alive. Most of them were children during the Holocaust. So they're asking the second generation, people like me, and the grandchildren, the third generation, to give the story of their relative. And Steven Spielberg many years ago had initiated a project called the Shoah Project, where he had videos done of many survivors. And my mother did one of those. So if you had this video of your relative, they worked on it, and together with the video and the speaking on the part of the descendant, but this all was put on hold now.
Yeah.
So this is how we would continue the legacy of the survivors.
So that younger people will continue to know about it. Before the COVID virus set in, on your recommendation, I went to see the Auschwitz exhibit that is up there now and has been up for a while, and found it very moving. It was like being in Auschwitz, actually, and being with the people there who were suffering and dying without having to suffer and die myself, which is a tribute to the realism of the exhibit. I think it's due in part to the artifacts that are on display and also the videos that are available to be seen. But I'd just like to ask, I know you were going to give a tour of that exhibit to TCC members before the virus kicked in. Can you share a little bit about what you would have said on that tour and what you hope people take away from that exhibit?
Well, one of the first things I would say on the tour is that in addition to the 6 million Jews who died in the camps like Auschwitz, 5 million non-Jews died. And the first camps were built for German political prisoners, and then the Nazis put in anyone who they perceived as an enemy in the other countries. So I emphasize that because it makes non-Jews see their own self-interest in preventing something like this. If it was just a Jewish issue, they might not really care very much. So I try to broaden it and show that this can happen to any group. And it did happen to other groups, to Gypsies, for instance. They were another group that was targeted just like the Jews on a purely racial, ethnic basis.
Well, you remind me, there's a famous phrase by, I think, a Christian pastor, Martin Niemöller, who said, he listed several different groups that they came for, and they weren't at first his group, but once they start coming for another group, they will eventually come for your own group, was the point of his quotation. You make me think of that when you say what you just said.
Right, the last line of that is, and when they came for me, there was no one else to help, in other words. Yeah.
And it suggests that we are more bound up with each other than we may think. Yeah. Well, Shirley, thank you for sharing all of this from your life and from your time in TCC.